why do organizations of all sizes and types need to start focusing on disaster and climate resilient supply systems? Well, the University of Waterloo, with Waterloo Climate Institute, support from Natural Resources Canada, recently released a strategy playbook for disaster and climate resilient supply systems. And this is applicable to organizations regardless of being small, medium, or large corporate entities. And it's applicable to for-profit, not-for-profit, charities, and community organizations. So I want to dive into this really important topic about building disaster and climate resilience in supply systems because locally here in the Edmonton region, there's a big push to position the region as a not only a defense industry hub for dual use technology, but with that can bring an influx again of population, services, organizations, new facilities. So I wanted to look at this new strategy playbook developed by the University of Waterloo Climate Institute because it's in collaboration with the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. And it's based on over a decade of research and practical work with companies across the Americas. And I'm also going to add in my own expertise and experience with this because I've worked for the federal government, provincial government. I've worked for the city of Edmonton. I've worked overseas in the United States, in Guatemala. I lived in Australia, and I've recently was in Norway at the Arctic Emergency Management Conference. I've worked for General Electric, and I started my own career in disaster and emergency management back in 2007, where I got on with the government of Alberta in 2008 and had the luxury of working with Tina Maslik, who is the now, I think she's still there, the director at the government of Alberta. She might be an executive director, but she's always been involved in business continuity from a health department side. And that's where I started my career. And I've also, developed courses for the U of A in their occupational health and safety program for business continuity, and courses for, Medicine Hat College on crisis leadership, and have led several teams through disaster response and recovery. So I find this playbook interesting, especially the findings and recommendations. And I think it's very timely for Canada, especially given how climate change is increasingly disrupting supply chains worldwide. We've had the United States, do its thing over the last year, and now we're going to see major disruptions with the attack on Iran. And the playbook focuses on Canadian businesses, but the insights are definitely relevant globally, and they're relevant to Indigenous organizations and communities. And what really stands out for me is the emphasis on shared strategies across multiple actors in the supply chain rather than isolated efforts by individual companies. And I was really surprised by this because I thought, you know, at least large global companies were, maybe relatively sophisticated in their shared strategies. But this report kind of highlights a little bit otherwise. And this is following a trend that we've seen, evolving through government emergency management, community emergency management. That's all coming down from, the UN's work in disaster risk reduction. So the introduction of the document kind of sets the stage, right? Talks about the typical climate impacts of drought, floods, storms, heat waves that are creating, these cascading disruptions across production, transportation, and retail. And they're not just operational hiccups, they threaten economic and social security, especially in vulnerable regions. And I would even argue cultural security with indigenous groups and communities. And the key insight is that no single company can build resilience alone. We've known that for decades. It requires integrated multi actor strategies that build capacity and can direct resources to the most critical points in the supply system. So not that different from incident management on a large system where it's all about coordinating resources to fulfill objectives and priorities. But this is maybe in a obviously in a larger scale, and it's I think it's a shift from traditional risk management to a more collaborative systems thinking approach. And I'll I want to add on the systems thinking. It doesn't go into this document so much, but this is where I tie in indigenous knowledge because systems thinking has generally been very what I would call surface level focused, meaning it kind of focuses on the infrastructure, the the networks of people and those physical assets. But at Hazardscape, we take a lot deeper approach to embodying risk through kind of what was hinted here, the social fabric, but also the cultural and the human side of systems, because everything is connected. So you've got to include the political, the cultural, the social, and the human, along with the financial. And you certainly have to include the natural aspects of a system. So that interconnectedness, we can't relegate it to simply these sort of organizational system pieces. And systems thinking is applicable because supply chains are complex webs. A disruption in one place will send a ripple through the entire system. And the playbook here really dives home that stability, or drives home, sorry, stability depends on collective adaptation and shared learning, not just isolated actions. Where I pick up on that part is when I was in Norway at the Arctic Emergency Management Conference, I became connected in with a researcher out of Denmark, Jacob Tarup, and him and I had a conversation, and we still message each other a little bit through comments on LinkedIn, but he delivered a resilience engineering model that I instantly connected with because we're doing a very similar approach at Hazardscape, incorporating, indigenous knowledge, connectedness, non-directive coaching, disaster management tools and processes. So when we have to look at collective, adapted, and shared learning, there is a model for this, and this is something that we at Hazardscape focus on and use all the time. We have an assessment for it, which, depending on the size of an organization, if you've got about 80 staff, it can take 3 weeks from top, starting to getting at least a draft report ready. If it's a smaller organization of just a few staff, it could take no more than a week. But this report kind of goes on about how this is a big shift because traditional strategies like diversifying suppliers or shifting sourcing locations are becoming less effective as climate risks expand globally. Plus, those approaches can undermine the trust and partnerships that companies have built over time. If they're starting to fail on their deliverables, in the supply chain, that's going to erode trust because it's a very profit driven metric, which is pretty easy to measure for a lot of companies. The playbook points out that the risk information and resources are often siloed within companies, which limits their strategic decision making. So Collaboration and information sharing become even more essential to build long-term trusted relationships. And I can see that, if you're an intellectual property expert or lawyer, you're probably picking up on that because, especially for-profit corporations, information sharing gets a little bit tricky with, espionage and, like I said, intellectual property risk. But organizations are going to have to figure out how to become better at sharing that essential information to enhance trust. And I don't think that's anything new. It's just in this case, it's critical. And this is not just for climate risks. The United Nations has, I think, 261 or 281 classifications for different or 261, 281 hazards that are all classified. So this playbook also goes into how volatile markets, shifting geopolitics, and fragmented supply chains can add layers of complexity. So resilience thinking needs to be embedded in business strategy for the short and the long term. The playbook, it also identifies four main barriers, which I was a little bit shocked to see this, because again, we see this at the community level. And I I think Canada in general does a good job from observing what's not going well, and sort of learning from them. But obviously, industry and supply chain actors have maybe a little bit of catch up, because the barriers that companies face when trying to develop, these multi-actor resilience strategies. The first, it's like a lack of specificity in understanding climate and disaster risks at different levels of the organization and across the supply chain, and even in the communities, I would add, that they participate in. And maybe I'm not so surprised at that, because maybe companies are so focused on, kind of their real-time operations, and not understanding climate and disaster risk. I thought they would have been spending a bit more time, because doing that can really mitigate impacts to the bottom line. But again, little surprised to hear that. Um, Companies often struggle to translate these broad climate frameworks, like the Sendai framework or even the Sustainable Development Goals, into, very specific, actionable risk assessments tailored to their supply chain. And risk information is fragmented. Um, they're claiming even sometimes unreliable or treated as confidential, which makes targeted investments difficult for them. Again, I was kind of surprised to hear that. And that ties into, the second barrier, which is siloed information, resources, and communication channels. Information often stays trapped in departments or companies, leading to duplication and, inefficiencies, which makes a whole lot of sense. Smaller suppliers, especially in very vulnerable regions, they often lack the skills and resources to participate effectively in, being able to broaden out their information into other areas, resources, and communications. So, um, communication tends to focus on short-term operational needs rather than strategic resilience, which I thought was interesting, because I would inherently think that large companies, maybe not so much small business, but large ones, kind of have it built in that they've got to talk about their long-term strategy, which maybe they do, but maybe not about the resilience. So adaptation efforts are becoming fragmented or unevenly distributed, which weakens the overall supply chain. The third barrier is the normalization of disaster losses and recovery costs. And this, again, is something we see at the community level, at the government level, especially in Canada. Our culture is a focus on response and recovery. So companies tend to focus on recovery and reconstruction, treating those just as normal costs or losses, and maybe their insurance absorbs some of that. But financial and procurement systems prioritize short-term efficiency over long-term resilience. That was something found in here, and I find that deeply disturbing. Because it's, if we look at the Alberta as an example with our boom and bust oil and gas, I mean, right there is a perfect example of the government prioritizing short-term revenue into operations, not diversifying. They're not putting money into the heritage fund, so the overall long-term resilience is degraded. And this approach can shift risks and costs onto smaller suppliers or local communities, which undermines sort of that broader benefit that resilience investments could deliver. And the fourth final barrier is the misalignment between adaptation needs and sustainability certifications, meaning certification schemes can be, costly and often don't align with the actual climate adaptation needs. So companies may prioritize certification compliance over meaningful resilience investments because I would imagine they want that certification and they can say that they have it, but if those certifications aren't meaningful, then the resilience investment isn't going to provide much return. So and on these certifications, they often lack tailored contingency plans or risk frameworks specific to supply chains. So they limit organizational learning and continuous improvement, which again goes back to the engineering resilient systems work that Jacob presented at the Norway conference. Because those are really meant to take again that look at how can organizational learning be not just about skills of the individual worker for the future, right? It's got to be about learning to be resilient, improving to be resilient, more than just being able to deliver or do R&D or produce AI and these sort of sales related, marketing related outcomes. So all these barriers are interconnected and they do reinforce each other, which again makes multi-actor resilience very challenging. And if we want to look a little bit more local, like especially in Alberta with smaller agricultural suppliers, they typically bear the financial burden of certifications but lack the resources to invest in climate adaptation, which can weaken the whole supply chain. So moving to designing a shared strategy for disaster management and climate adaptation, the playbook emphasizes identifying shared risks along supply chains, including the ripple effects downstream. So an example that they give is heat stress on field workers upstream, causing fluctuations in crop availability downstream. So it's not just about these sort of direct operational risks, but also about these indirect impacts that have maybe not been mapped out or measured. And it's important to identify which businesses bear the highest risk, considering both exposure and vulnerability, that is, their capacity to cope, right? Solutions might involve supporting actors outside a company's direct control, like investing in cooling spaces for workers or emergency transport. So, what I what I found interesting in this role of informal communication and daily operational routines in understanding risks and identifying practical solutions, right? It's not just about formal risk assessments, but also about the insights gained from on the ground interactions. And that's kind of what I talked about in terms of embodying the risk at the social, cultural, human, and natural side, because the playbook does discuss balancing technical and social strategic approaches. But sort of what they call these large anchor companies, they often use very centralized technical methods, structured procedures, manuals, benchmarking tools, where small and medium-sized businesses or enterprises, they can benefit from the more social learning approaches, having peer-to-peer dialogues, field visits, learning by doing. The optimal strategy that they present in the document sort of mixes both, negotiated among partners to fit the supply chain's realities. So it's like a bit of a dance between the top-down technical rigor and the bottom-up social learning that are both essential for resilience. And I think if what they call the anchor companies and the small to medium can kind of meet in the middle there, we could see some good results. And then larger companies need to consider, small, medium-sized business operation realities so they can design inclusive strategies. While smaller companies also need to align with larger partners' processes to sort of systemize climate risk management, right? That's that support between the two of them. So, risk mapping helps prioritize critical links and geographical hotspots, for example, like coastal zones or drought prone areas. It also involves identifying existing resources like human, technical, financial resources that all can be mobilized for resilience, much like, again, going back to my incident command management or system analogy is, finance, technical, human, resources, the operational side. Those are all kind of within the incident management realm. And you can, in a way, scale that up because, we often talk about incident command system being scalable, but I kind of look at it as where would that scale end? Well, it doesn't end. It doesn't. There is no limit to the scalability of something like an incident command system. So it's very applicable to these larger supply chain operations. And the playbook highlights understanding system thresholds like financial and operational. So, for example, financial thresholds can relate to an organization's ability to absorb shocks and recover, while operational thresholds relate to tolerance for disruption and recovery time. But if an organization can know these thresholds, it helps target investment and design, right, to customize plans. It's a way to focus resources where they'll have the most impact. The second component is enhancing system-wide communication and information flows. So this kind of includes developing agreed protocols for sharing risk information, contingency plans, and business continuity strategies. It's about establishing clear communication channels, roles for decision making during crisis, coordinating disaster alert protocols for localized risk management, right? All those things. Third, goes into ensuring the right combination of skill sets. So, whatever, they're needed, right? Including senior planners, advocates for resource mobilization, technical and operational staff with local knowledge, field workers, communications experts, even climate risk specialists and disaster management specialists, because this diversity like we see in at the community level, it's going to break down silos and supports both internal and external engagement, and it's about bringing together the right expertise to help make informed decisions with making solution implementation and change a little bit easier. The fourth component that they talk about is, again, identifying and addressing barriers to shared strategy. So, again, this means reorganizing issues like confidentiality, restricting information sharing, mismatch technologies, again, intellectual property, inconsistent climate risk terminology, right? As we know in incident management, having a common terminology is key. Even unsynchronized business rhythms, cultural differences, fragmented sustainability approaches, even a variable commitment at variable commitment levels, implementation, and resistance to change. Those are all things that having a shared strategy can address. And I know it's a pretty big list, but we have to acknowledge these barriers. That's kind of the first step because again, it's like when I was teaching search and rescue. You know what the first step is when you're lost? Admitting you're lost. And if organizations can acknowledge these barriers, they can start to overcome them. And these larger anchor companies can lead this process by fostering trust and collaboration. Fifth component is diffusing early warning systems across the system. And not a surprise here because we know again at community levels, public alerting, early warning is the key to preparedness and mitigation of injury and saving life and death. So connecting supply chain actors to early warning systems that helps them to take on timely preventative measures, right? It helps them to react before they get hit. So documenting geographic risks and real-time conditions helps informs decisions. Training staff on response protocols linked to those alerts is very critical, and that's why coming up with different scenarios and courses of action are so important. And early warning, we know that it doesn't only help prepare for the immediate, it also informs longer term adaptation planning because people start to kind of build in that rhythm of knowing that the information they're getting is credible, it's coming in sooner, it breeds confidence, it breeds curiosity and learning, and helps with that adaptation. So the last component, number 6, is creating a shared inventory of practices and solutions. Knowledge hub, right? A repository of tested resilience solutions, something like that, accessible to all supply chain partners. It helps understand partners' needs. You can set priorities, identify investment opportunities, case studies, things like that. It avoids overly prescriptive recommendations because the key here is tailoring solutions to the realities of both small and medium organizations and larger companies, just like we do with the community. There is no one size fits all for an indigenous or non-indigenous community. We have to treat these sort of supply chain ecosystems between companies in the exact same way. So, the whole goal here is really to empower Canada's ecosystem to own adaptation strategies rather than outsourcing them to very generic best practices. And the last thing I'll say about the playbook, again, it emphasizes climate adaptation is evolving. Of course, we're always learning, right? That system is learning. It's an ongoing process requiring continuous innovation, curiosity, and learning. And if we can get to an integrated multi-actor strategy, create real value for businesses and communities, industrial level collaboration and resilient trade corridors, those can amplify the gains that everyone's doing. So what's going to really help accelerate some of this? Well, technology platforms, communication systems, they help to build evidence, multi-actor teams. They can identify gaps and advocate for resources, being able to maybe translate into economic benefits like secured product stocks, reduced price volatility, improved supply chain security, and even lower financial impacts from disasters. So Again, partnerships among companies, industry, governments, all support institutions are key to building disaster resilient supply systems that are going to manage climate change. It's no different than what we do at the community level of 100 to 200 people to millions. I think there's definitely a call to rethink risk management, not only as a solo endeavor, but this has got to now be a collective journey, especially for Canada. And I hope that this podcast sparks some ideas for you. And if I'll go on to say that our resilience engineering assessment doesn't just look at kind of the surface level response, emergency response, kind of regular stuff. We go deep into, again, the social, cultural, human, natural aspects, political and financial, right? And even the built areas, because again, we are all connected. Everything is connected, and it's not just at sort of a physical level. So if you'd like some more information on this, or would like to, discuss what we're doing, or how your small, medium, or large organization can incorporate some of this stuff, just reach out to Hazardscape. Support at hazardscape.com. Message us, brad.eisen@hazardscape.com. Thanks for listening. Hope leave your comments and share and like this if you found it valuable, so others like you can find it. Take care.